Very much, Ari. It's a truly honor and a pleasure to be with you, to be with CSP, and with so many people. I really feel humbled by the invitation. I'm grateful to Mark Epstein. We're going to talk about our organization, Bet Venezia, and it gives me a special pleasure to be virtually in California. That is a place that means a lot to me in many ways. Julia Lupton is one of the scholars that I admire the most, so that's an additional privilege to have her here. And what I would like to do tonight, no, here it is 9 p.m. here in Venice, Italy, this afternoon for you, is to persuade as many people as possible, not only to visit Venice in the near future, but actually to move here. So please be aware that my final speech today will be to persuade you that is the right time to move to Venice, because we need the new residents. California has so many, Venice has fewer and fewer. It's actually a great time to move to Venice. And this is actually something closely related to the topic of my talk, because what I'm going to do today in the next 40 minutes or so is that I want to explore the strange, ambivalent, troubling relationship that exists between a fictitious character. So it's very appropriate that you dedicated this talk to a fictitious character, because we are going to talk about the most famous Venetian Jew of all times, someone called Shylock, that I'm afraid most people know, even if they are not overly familiar with Shakespeare. Is a fictitious character, is sort of a proverbial character and notorious character. Shylock is the protagonist of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, one of Shakespeare's early comedies, but also a character that, of course, never existed, but that overshadowed the real history of the actual Jews of Venice, a community to which I belong, to which my family belonged. And so as a scholar of Shakespeare, of course, I have a profound professional interest in Shakespeare and The Merchant of Venice. As a Venetian Jew, I have a problem with the fact that Shakespeare gave Venetian Jews a bad name, or more than that. That's the point of my talk. What you're seeing on the screen is a couple of pictures of production of The Merchant of Venice that took place in 2016, so 5 years ago in July, and that marked the 500 years of the existence of the Ghetto of Venice. So on the one hand, I'm going to talk about what happens in this play, that is one of the most performed plays of Shakespeare, and one of the most controversial, but also one of the most performed and read and taught and studied, and the reality that exists of Jewish Venice. So there is fiction and there's reality, and there are some interesting overlappings. And then 5 years ago, these two worlds collided or came together in the Ghetto of Venice. So I hope I can take you through a 500 years old journey in a little bit over half an hour. And then I look forward to questions or comments or remarks, and especially, I guess, people's reaction and experience of reading, watching, attending, or even, who knows, acting in The Merchant of Venice. All right, so to give you a few chronological coordinates, it all starts somehow with William Shakespeare, who famously didn't invent almost any of his stories, reading a book. So sometimes when he was in his 30s, William Shakespeare came across a book written by an Italian author who had lived a couple of centuries before him, someone we know almost nothing about, who published a book called Il Pecorone, which in Italian means the big sheep, but it means the simpleton. And in that story, there was a character an anonymous character that is referred to simply as the Jew of Mestre. Mestre is to this day the first mainland town across the lagoon. So if you're in Venice, or if you've landed in Venice with your plane, you may have come through Mestre. So there is the story of a Jewish moneylender who loans money to an Italian merchant called Ansaldo in this book. And the penalty for not repaying the debt in time is a pound of flesh. The pound of flesh that then Shakespeare made very famous, but he didn't invent this image, this trope. He got it from the book. So what happens between the writing of the Pecorone in the Middle Ages, sometimes in the 14th century, and the moment when Shakespeare reads this book and decides to move the story from Mestre in the mainland to Venice? When Ser Giovanni Fiorentino, this Italian author, wrote the story about the Jewish anonymous moneylender, the Jews were not allowed, were not authorized to reside in the city of Venice. They could do business in Venice, they could come to Venice, they could stay for a couple of weeks maximum, but they were not authorized to live in the city. And then, some 50 years before Shakespeare was born, something very important happened. And that was that Venice, which at the time was an independent and very powerful republic, a very, very famous Italian state that other European states looked enviously at, including Shakespeare's England, Venice lost a war, lost territories, lost people, and had an influx of refugees into the city, including many Jews. That was in 1509. And a few years later, people in Venice, the authorities started becoming very nervous because the Jews, they were going everywhere, sharing houses with Christians. And as this document that I'm sharing with you says, perpetrating misdemeanors and detestable and abominable acts. In other words, Jews were hanging out with Christians, and that was not good. That was seen as a potential threat to a God-fearing subject of our state. So the question is, should we expel the Jews from the city because they are now mingling with the Christians, or should we keep them? And there was a fierce debate in the Senate of the Republic of Venice. And after that, a compromise was reached. And the compromise is a compromise that has had a tremendous influence, not only on local history, but I would say on global history as at large. Because the final decree was that all the Jews who were at present living in different parishes within our city, and all others who may come here, shall be obliged to go at once to dwell together in the houses in the court within the Ghetto. So this is the first historic occurrence of a word that then was called and pronounced Ghetto, which in Italian means foundry. It was an abandoned copper foundry, Ghetto, in the peripheral part of the city near the train station. Those of you who have visited may have been there. So very far from the center, very from St. Mark's Square, very far from Rialto. And the simple reason was that the Ghetto was the only square in Venice that didn't have a church. So it was possible to confine the Jews there without disrespecting a Christian shrine. And so on the 29th of March of 1516, all the Jews of Venice were forced, that was Passover, by the way. So in a sort of counter exodus or a new exodus, the Jews were forced to live segregated in a small neighborhood And it's a big irony of history that that place then became the name of all, or of many, certainly not all, of many segregated Jewish quarters and also ethnic neighborhoods in history. It is probably the German Jews who were the first to settle there that mispronounced ghetto as ghetto, and hence the word ghetto has become a term that we find in many, many languages, including Italian, English, and so on. You may have read, or you maybe read other sources that suggest that ghetto has a different etymology. Some people suggest that it has to do with get, divorce in Hebrew, that it comes from borghetto, which means small town in Italian. Those are all very clever etymologies, but they're all false. The simple fact is that ghetto was a toponym, was the name of a place, and that's where the Jews had to live. Why not expelling them? Because Jews were necessary, because they were moneylenders. They were needed for the local economy, an economy that was in trouble because of this lost war. So on the one hand, the Jews were needed. On the other hand, they were felt as a threat, as a possible contamination of Christian society, a corrupting agent. So, okay, let's keep them, and let's keep them shut at night. But the doors, the gates of the ghetto were open during the day. And so it was both a closed and an open neighborhood. And now, for those of you who have been there, and for those of you who have not been there, this is a map of Venice. Venice has famously the shape of a fish. You see that this is the map with all the black dots has the different ethnic enclaves that you can find in Venice. Venice was a very cosmopolitan city. It had an Armenian community, a Greek community, an Albanian community, a Persian community, but all those communities were very close to the center, where the tourists go today, San Mark's. And you see in that red circle, that's where the ghetto was. Campo de Ghetto Nuovo. In Venetian, it is spelled with only one T. And it was in the 1550s, so 40 years later, that the Pope says, oh, what a great idea to lock up the Jews. And he basically imported the word ghetto to Rome. And from there, the word ghetto, as shown by some very good scholars, the word ghetto has traveled extensively. And in the 20th century, it reached the United States, where it started being used for the many ethnic enclaves. And now many people think of ghetto not as a Jewish word, but as a word that belongs or pertains to other communities. Obviously, the most tragic use of the word and the concept was during World War II, when the Nazi, of course, created some ghettos in Eastern Europe that were basically the antechamber to the death camps. And I want to say that this is a very important element, because many people who to this day travel to the Ghetto of Venice tend to, in a way, mistake or superimpose the notion of the Nazi ghetto with that of the Italian ghettos. And of course, there is, unfortunately, some sort of, relationship, but those were very, very different phenomena. The Ghetto of Venice was never a place of extermination, was never a place of killing. It was, of course, also a place that had its own troubles and victims during the war, but it was something else. This is your bird's eye view of the ghetto, and you see that many people who come here today say, is that all? The ghetto is basically two adjacent squares. This is the large one. This is the so-called Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto, which was actually the old one, where Italian and German Jews were not allowed, were either allowed or forced to live, depending how you look at it. Right now, it gives you a sense of a very open place because you see a bridge, you see there is a large opening where the bridge is, but in origin, it was like a little fortress, all surrounded by very high buildings. Jews were not allowed to own any property there. They were renting from Christian landlords who very quickly decided to raise the rents so that they could make money because the Jews had no alternative. So the ghetto was a compromise. For the Jews of Venice, it was more acceptable, more convenient to stay inside a locked neighborhood, because in many other places in Europe, it was much worse. They had been expelled from England. They had been expelled from certain German territories. They had been expelled from Spain in 1492, famously. And this is another reason why, and this is very important for our talk, the fact that the Ghetto of Venice was a truly multi-ethnic Jewish neighborhood. Some of you have, I guess, I'm sure, Ashkenazi roots from different part of Europe. Some of you have Sephardic roots from Spain and Portugal. Other may have been from Greece. Anyway, so Venice, the Ghetto of Venice, was not just the area of one community. It was actually an area of 4 or 5, depending how you count them, communities that brought to Venice their different backgrounds, languages. And so the ghetto became a true Jewish melting pot, and more than that. And we'll see that as I continue with my conversation. All right. So The Merchant of Venice, it's about this Merchant of Venice of the title, not Shylock, but Antonio, who goes to the Jewish moneylender Shylock to get a loan of 3,000 ducats to help his friend Bassanio, who in turn wants to woo a Venetian lady who is richly left, a lady richly left. So there's a woman called Portia that will be married off to whoever finds her picture inside one of 3 caskets made of gold, silver, and lead. But if you want to go and court her, you have to have, your own amount of money. Bassanio doesn't have the money, goes to Antonio, and Antonio, who is a Jew hater, he hates the Jews, but he needs money from a Jewish moneylender, and he goes to Shylock. Now, what you see in the picture today is actually a place that doesn't exist anymore. It was a small museum that recreated the ambience of a pawn shop that truly existed in the ghetto. Famously, the first words of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice are about the money. 3,000 ducats for 3 months, and Antonio bound. 3,000 ducats for 3 months, and if these 3,000 ducats will not be repaid in time, for a merry sport, so, as a joke, Shylock will be allowed to cut an equal pound of flesh from the body of Antonio. As we heard before, this is not something that Shakespeare has invented himself, but he's taken from the book. So there is this very intense conversation in the play where Antonio and Shylock show that they hate each other, but they will do business. So there is something, let's say, very realistic about that. The Christians of Venice were actually interested, almost obliged to do business with the Jews, even if they despised them for religious reasons. And the Jews were, they had beautiful things to say about Venice, but of course they were not happy about being, as I said, locked up at night. What I would like to do is to give you a few bits from the play and compare them to the reality. So 3,000 ducats is not entirely clear how big a sum it is, but let's say that 3,000 ducats is maybe $300,000, so it's a huge sum. It's a big, big sum. In reality, the Jews of Venice were licensed to lend at most 3 ducats, so 1/1000th of what Shylock is lending to Antonio. So that's where the fantasy, the imagination of Shakespeare, sort of say, escalates, as it were. So we see Shylock is seen as someone who handles an inordinate amount of money, but in fact, the Jews of Venice were not super rich people who gave huge sums to Christians and noblemen, but they were mostly small moneylenders giving small loans to poor people. I think you know that money lending was an activity that Jews were specialists at, because it's one of the few things they were authorized to do. Jews in the Ghetto of Venice could only lend money, practice medicine, sell second-hand clothes, or be something that is, even less known than the rest. They could be dance and music teachers. And for someone like, a Venetian Jew, it's really a sorry thing that most people still associate Jews with money and not with dance and music. It would be a much better stereotype and prejudice if, people thought that Jews were all good dancers and musicians as opposed to be attached to money. And so, in a way, the fact that Shylock has been associated with this the most infamous loan in the history of literature, has certainly contributed to anti-Semitism. Shylock himself seems not to have those 3,000 ducats, and he refers to another Jewish character in the play, the other Jewish male character that appears in the play, called Tubal. And he tells Tubal later in the play, "Go, Tubal, and meet me at our synagogue." This is something that happens much later in the play, Act 3, when something else that we'll talk about later happens. So what was Shylock's synagogue? There are 5 beautiful synagogues in the Ghetto of Venice. Some of you may have seen at least 3 of them. I hope the others will have a chance to see them. There's no other place in Europe where you can see 5 synagogues that were built between 400 and 500 years ago in, their original condition, as it were. I'm put on this picture the German synagogue, that is the oldest one, built in 1528, and the Levantine synagogue, that is older and was used by the Levantine community of Jews that had escaped the Iberian Peninsula and had temporarily relocated in the east. The Levantine synagogue is world famous for 2 reasons. One is that I was bar mitzvah there, and the second is that Al Pacino played Shylock in the Merchant of Venice movie of 2004 by Michael Radford that some of you may have seen. And of course, the Michael Radford chose the Levantine synagogue as the backdrop of the movie because it's a far more theatrical. It's a Baroque synagogue, and Baroque edifices are eminently theatrical. But the truth is that Shylock, if he had existed, he would not have been a Levantine merchant. Even some very authoritative, famous critics, such as Harold Bloom, made the false assumption that Shylock must have been Sephardic because he's Italian. No, moneylenders in Venice were German. And so Shylock would have been an Ashkenazi Jew, or maybe to a lesser extent an Italian Jew, but Italians were also mostly either from Rome or from Ashkenaz.
Sorry to interrupt, but people ask the question, which shul and which is the German shul, which is the Levantine shul? Is the German on the left and the Levantine on the right?
The German is the golden one, even though all the gold that you see there is actually a later 18th century addition. So in fact, the original, the German synagogue was very plain, and it was actually created inside a room with false marble. The Venice stipulated that synagogues should not be visible from the outside, that Jews could pray, but did not have to show off their worship, and so they had very limited, they have many restrictions. The one on the right is the Levantine one, and has all these twisted columns and a lot of wood, and that is a characteristic of Baroque architecture and decoration. By the way, and this is an element that I think might be interesting, is that none of these synagogues were built or made by Jews. As I said before, professions were heavily restricted, so the Jews had to employ architects and sculptors that came from the Christian community, which made for a sort of, ironical, very profound cultural exchange. So the Jews hired the architect needed to know, what you can do, you cannot do in a synagogue. And so the ghetto became as much a place of cultural contact as a place of separation. So today we think that ghetto and ghettoization means separation. But if we look at history, the ghetto became, out of necessity, a great place of cultural contact, including the fact, but this is for another slide, so this fact, I'll keep it there. And this is what I was thinking of. In Act 1, Scene 3, Shylock explains why he is entitled to do his business, why he's entitled to make money, against the sarcasm and the vilification that comes from Antonio and Bassanio, and makes a reference to a scene in the Bible with Jacob's and Laban. So he knows his Bible, he knows his Torah. And this is, to me, a way to connect the Shylock to a historical figure that deserves far more attention and that there has been. Leon Modena was the most famous rabbi of early modern Venice. He was roughly a contemporary of Shakespeare. He was born a few years after Shakespeare. He died much later than Shakespeare. He had a long life, and we know a lot about him because he wrote an autobiography in Hebrew that has been translated into English, among other things. And we know a lot about everyday life in the ghetto thanks to him. He had a very troubled life. He had a serious gambling problem, so he gambled away most of the money he made with his 26 different occupations. He has, among other things, a list of all the jobs that he had. He was a teacher, he was a cantor, he was a translator, he was many, many different things. And he died a poor man, but he's left an amazing scholarship, because what is also forgotten, or let's say made less visible because of this shadow of Shylock projected on the ghetto was a great place of Jewish scholarship and knowledge, not only for the local community, but for the Jewish community in Europe at large, and for also the growing number of Christians who were interested in Jewish religion, culture. Whoever has ever read a book that might be called today Judaism 101, Introduction to Judaism, Judaism for Dummies, you should pay your respect to Leon Modena, because Leon Modena, among other things, is the author of the first book that explains Jewish rights from a non-antagonistic, non-anti-Semitic point of view for a non-Jewish readership. Before Leon Modena, all the books explaining what the Jews do, the practice, the ritual, the prayers, the holidays, were either written by Christians who wanted to show that Jewish religion was bad, or written by Jewish converts that had become Christians and were talking negatively about all Jewish rights. So Leon Modena writes a history of Hebrew rights that is a very, let's say, objective description of Jews. And that was done on the commission of King James I, one of the kings that, of course, Shakespeare was associated with. By the way, I have not said yet, I left it implicit, but I think it should be spelled out, that everything I'm telling you, everything I'm showing you, Shakespeare did not see. Shakespeare wrote about Venice, wrote The Merchant of Venice. A few years later, wrote the second Venetian play, Othello, the Moor of Venice, but most certainly, he never set foot in Italy or in Venice. Everything he knew was from books and maybe from Venetian merchants who hanged out in London. So this is an incredibly interesting thing. But even if he doesn't mention the ghetto, he must have heard of the fact that Jews were now living in the ghetto. There was a community. So in The Merchant of Venice, in the play, there is a sense that Christians know where Jews live, and then Jews live as a kind of matter of fact in the city of Venice. There have been attempts, mostly, not really scholarly ones, to demonstrate otherwise. There is a whole, let's say, phenomenon of people trying to show that Shakespeare actually did go to Venice, that Shakespeare was not who he was. I once received a very courteous call from a lovely woman who wanted to demonstrate that Shakespeare was a Sicilian Jew, which is, a fantastic notion, but, one of the many wild theories that exist. And I told her that, it would have been great to meet Shakespeare's mother, but other than that, there's no, basis for thinking otherwise. So the most simple explanation is that Shakespeare was a voracious reader, was a great listener, and he absorbed. And the fact that there were no Jews in England at the time made it very so curious to find out what Jews were like in their everyday dealings with Christians. So in a way, there is a little scholarly side to Shylock that I would like to ideally associate with Leon Modena and the other great scholars in the ghetto. I will also mention that thanks to this very diverse Jewish presence and to this interest by non-Jews for Jewish culture, Venice became the most important European center for the production of Hebrew books. So the first Talmud, for instance, famously was the Babylonian Talmud, was first printed in Venice by a Flemish printer called Daniel Bomberg, who's not Jewish. And so Venice became this place where Jews and non-Jews collaborated to produce Jewish books. The most extraordinary woman, the most extraordinary intellectual in the ghetto was a woman. In the Merchant of Venice, the other Jewish character is Jessica, Shylock's daughter. Shylock's daughter is the young woman who wants to run away from Shylock. She finds Shylock's house hell. She wants to escape from the ghetto. She wants to convert to Christianity. She actually elopes with her lover, Lorenzo. She converts to Christianity, ends up being welcomed in Christian society, but she's not very happy after all. But it's very important that in the Merchant of Venice, there is this dichotomy between the old Jewish man who is, in a way, not happy to become a Christian, even though at the end of the play, he will have to become a Christian himself. And Jessica, who is naturally a Christian, is a young woman who's just waiting to be saved from her Jewish roots. Though I am a daughter to his blood, says Jessica, I shall end this strife, become a Christian and thy loving wife. And I'd like to compare Jessica with a real Jewish woman who lived in the ghetto in the early 17th century called Sarah Kopia Sulam, who in her 20s organized what we would call in modern terms a literary salon, an intellectual academy where Jews and Christians would come together and discuss poetry, philosophy, and other cultural topics. So she was a Jewish woman, a Jewish intellectual, and someone who was absolutely conversant with contemporary culture. So you see another piece of evidence that the ghetto was not just a place that separated Jews and Christians, but was also a place that brought together Jews and Christians, at least temporarily, because Sarah Kopia Sulam was silenced very early because she was accused of denying the immortality of the soul, which was an equally damning accusation for Jews and Christians. And after publishing and writing poetry and some philosophy, she spent the second half of her life as probably a devout and silent wife after she was, as I said, involved in a number of controversies. And I'm going to say a few things about that in a few minutes. This is, as I said, just a mosaic of different uses of the word ghetto in the world, from Eastern European ghettos to uses of ghetto in pop culture, ghetto in South Africa, the ghetto in the States. Let me wholeheartedly recommend a book by Princeton scholar called Ghetto: The Invention of a Place, The History of an Idea, Mitchell Dunier. This is a recent book that explains how the word ghetto traveled from Venice in the 16th century to the United States and American culture in the 20th and 21st century. So what has happened is that I've given you a very rough overview of the world of the ghetto in the 16th century and the differences and similarities between the world of the play and the world of the place. But then what has happened is that there has been an influence between the ghetto and Shakespeare also in the afterlife of the play. And this is a picture of 1935, when The Merchant of Venice was staged in the streets of Venice by a Jewish Austrian director called Max Reinhardt, who was a very famous director for the first edition of the Venice Biennale. The Biennale is to this day the most famous art fair in Venice. And the first theater Biennale in 1935 was inaugurated with Max Reinhardt and the staging of the Merchant of Venice. There is a terrible irony there, because only 3 years after that staging, the Jews of Italy were declared enemies of the state. They were declared an enemy race, an altogether different race, after they had been, let's say, integrated into Italian society. The ghetto was emancipated in 1797 by Napoleon. Venice joined the kingdom, the newly created Kingdom of Italy, in 1866. So in the mid-19th century, Jews had become Italian citizens like everybody else, or at least so they thought. Some of them, including members of my family, even, this is something so difficult to explain to people in general, and many Jewish people that come from, have Eastern European roots. Many Jews became card-carrying members of the fascist party of Italy, because fascism initially was not overly anti-Semitic, and for the Italian Jews, that was the ultimate proof of their loyalty to the state. They want to be like everybody else. They want to be Italian first and Jews second. And so some of them became fascist. And that misguided choice, was revealed in all its tragedy in October 1938, when Mussolini expelled all the Jews from schools, public positions, and a kind of new social ghettoization happened. What happens today? What happens today is that the ghetto has become a very important tourist destination. This is a picture that was published on CNN website in 2016, when there was a celebration, not a celebration, I wouldn't use this word, but a marking of the 500 years of the ghetto. And you see three things there. One, you see a Holocaust memorial, because yes, Jews were deported from Venice, and 246 people were deported from Venice. You see a modern member of Chabad, of the ultra-Orthodox group that came to Venice in the 1980s, but most people who come today to the ghetto and see them think that they are the authentic Jews of the city, and it's one of the ironies of the place. And then you see also a little booth where the police is stationed to protect the place. But 2016 was a magic moment, as it were, because this is a moment where we, as the local Jewish community, wanted to really think of the importance of the heritage of Jewish Venice and of making it very also topical and relevant. So I'll just give you a few examples. One is that we invited 3 contemporary poets, 3 women, all living in the States. Mina Alexander, who sadly passed away, was originally from India. Esther Starry Shore, who's also a very fine poet, translator, and Princeton scholar, and Rita Dav, who's one of the most famous African-American poets and the former poet laureate. And they, 3 of them, lived in Venice, explored the ghettos, and ended up writing poetry on Sara Kopio-Sulam, the woman from the 17th century. So this is an example of the living heritage that is, in a way, revived and made contemporary. But the most important thing, as far as we're concerned, was that for the first time, we brought Shylock to the ghetto with an American company called Colombari, an Italian name, but it's a New York-based company. We had this amazing experience of having the Merchant of Venice in the ghetto, of facing the fictitious character that had haunted the place for so long in the place itself. So there were 5 memorable nights in July 2016. And of course, the big question is, who's going to play Shylock? Who can be Shylock after so many famous Shylock, from Henry Irving that was used for, publicizing this talk, all the way to, the great and Dustin Hoffman and Al Pacino and so on and so forth. The director, Karin Kunrod, who is a New York director with Italian roots, made a very bold decision. They came to Venice in 2015, they rehearsed, she put together a very diverse company with Italian actors, American actors, Indian actors, Jewish actors, non-Jewish actors. And then she decided to have 5 different actors playing Shylock, all in the same production. A Jewish American actor, Ned Eisenberg, 2 Italian actors, an Indian actor, and a woman, a British woman. And it was precisely this very bold decision of casting a woman in the scene where Shylock gives his most famous speech, "Hath not a Jew eyes?" One of the most quoted, most repeated, even most misunderstood speeches by Shakespeare, but the one that in a way compensates, at least partially, for this strong recapitulation of stereotypes about the Jews. So Shylock is a moneylender, Shylock wants the pound of flesh, Shylock is someone who is cruel, but also Shylock is the author of this famously human appeal to the fact that we're all the same, we all have bodies, we all have the same dimensions, senses, affections, passions. And that speech was given by Karen Kunrod to Jenny Lee Jones, who played the part of the Jewish father who has seen his daughter elope. Now, there is a documentary in the making. Maybe one day you can see it for yourself. Some people would prefer more traditional staging with one actor playing the part, but I can tell you it was an incredibly intense situation. But it was also a way of saying Shylock is not a realistic character. Do not confuse, do not mistake Shylock for the reality of Jews. This is something else. And I'm coming to my conclusion, because this is just another picture of the play, the moment where Shylock is about to cut a pound of flesh, and Linda Powell, great actress playing Portia, stops him and prevent the cruel act from happening. And Shylock is not only denied a pound of flesh, also denied the money, and also has to convert to Christianity. We were so privileged to have not only these amazing stagings for 5 nights with thousands of people in attendance, but we also had an incredible sideshow because Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to Venice and she presided over a mock appeal where Shylock, Antonio, and Portia were retried. And to use Shylock's words, she played a most learned judge and passed a new sentence with some fellow judges. And so in one of the most spectacular venues in Venice, San Rocco, we had this amazing honor of seeing her at work. And so today that she's no longer with us, we think of her contribution even more fondly. And my last picture is one that brings us back to Venice today, because as a Venetian, as a scholar, as someone who cares deeply for the city, I feel that, even though the lockdown sent around pictures of Venice as an empty place, the truth is that Venice now is in trouble. Venice is in trouble because simply we have too many tourists. And this is not, my way of saying don't come to Venice, but it's a way of saying that Venice needs a different type of tourism, and that different types of tourism is symbolized by 2 pictures that relates to activity run by Bet Venezia, the organization that I'm part of, and then it's run by Professor Mark Epstein from Vassar College. So we have an American director, and that is what we could call, for the sake of brevity, cultural tourism. When people come to study, when people come to visit with some time, some curiosity, and they don't just come for a few hours to consume the city in a few hours. So Bet Venezia, that is our organization, has as its motto, live, learn, and create in Jewish Venice. And so I invite you in conclusion to plan your next visit to Venice as one where you can live, meaning, stay for a few more days, learn, try to find there are many educational options for all age groups, and maybe create. We've run a lot of artistic projects, such as the one that brought to the creation of the poetry on Sara Copia Sulam. And I'm really serious to say that there's one thing that COVID has taught us, sadly, is that there are so many jobs that are portable. So if you have a portable job, bring it to Venice. We have good cable, good internet connection. And there are some actual projects now to repopulate the city. We need students, we need artists, we need whoever, but also we need curious and respectful visitors. So thank you very much for listening. I know I have compressed a lot of information in 45 minutes, but I'm very happy now to answer any questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Would you unshare the screen and we'll have a time for some questions? I've been following the chat. So once you unshare, we'll make you the focus here. Okay. So first of all, how far back does your family go in Venice, in Italy or Venice?
Okay, there are 2 ways of looking at it. If I simply follow, let's say, my family name, I know that this family came that had a name that was Italianized into Bassi, which makes it difficult to trace them further back than that. It came from Germany at the end of the 18th century. And I was telling a friend a couple of hours ago, it's so interesting because 1797 is this watershed date. Before that, the ghetto was a segregated quarter. After that, it was open. So it's not clear whether my relative says, oh, let's move to Venice. It's nice to be in a kind of protected area, or if they heard about the opening up of the ghetto and went there. But if I chose another line in the family, I can boast of a Sephardic ancestor in the 16th century that went bankrupt in trying to sell books and moved to Amsterdam. So depending when you look at it.
How many Jews are in Venice today?
All right, that's a very important question. And if we count registered members of the Jewish community, we're talking about 500. But then there is also let's say there is Chabad that has their own little community, and there are at any given time a lot of students and visitors. So, if we strictly speaking 500s, loosely speaking, many more.
And people I know have visited Venice. I visited many years ago. They're worried about moving there because they say it's still sinking. So are you guys still sinking? Have you stabilized your water issues?
Oh, no, I mean, actually the whole world is sinking. So in a way, it's ironical that now sea level rise is a worldwide phenomenon. So, Venice is not naturally, more or less safe than Miami or New York. So my response is, this is a great place to think about these issues and maybe even to solve this issue. So, yes, it's a great place. It's a safe place. It's a beautiful place. And it's a place, I mean, again, I don't want this to come across as a joke. What I'm saying that one of the problems of Venice is that people do not realize that it's not just a fantasy place. It's an actual city with people who live, with families who work and who. And it's, as I said, if you're from Los Angeles, it's difficult to conceptualize a place where you do everything on foot. But, it's a great place. And my son, who's 12, has gone to school by himself since he was 10. So it's a great place.
Let's turn back to Shakespeare. So where does the name Shylock and Tubal come from? They don't sound like... Tubal maybe sounds a little more Jewish, but Shylock does not. So where do these names come from?
Yes. Tubal is actually a biblical name, even though, interestingly enough, doesn't refer to post-Abrahamic Judaism. But Shylock is, in fact, an English name. And there have been many attempts to demonstrate that Shylock is related to some Jewish or biblical name, but a very famous scholar called Stephen Orgel has demonstrated that probably Shakespeare were using that name to make fun of someone from London who was a Puritan, and so this hardline Protestant who identified with the Hebrews and hated theater. So Shakespeare, as a kind of inside joke, says, let's name this guy Shylock.
And if Julia Lupton is there, Julia, if you want to, chime in on any of this stuff, please do as well. And what about the pound of flesh? Where does that come from? Because that doesn't seem to be a Jewish concept either.
No, not at all. Then that's fine. So the pound of flesh is, as I said, something that is found in this tale, this medieval tale. There are other sources where you find this concept of the pound of flesh. One of the most thought-provoking theories is that the pound of flesh is a metaphor of circumcision, that this idea of the pound of flesh reflects the fear that Christians had of Jews cutting flesh from the bodies, which is something that in fact happens with circumcision. And circumcision was really the great divide between Jews and Christians. When Christianity was created, from Judaism, Paul, that Julia is a great expert of, Paul said, that Jews should stop, or that people should stop circumcising their flesh, and they should circumcise their heart, having a kind of spiritual covenant other than a physical covenant. So maybe the pound of flesh is an implicit reference to this idea of Jews not getting the spiritual part and insisting in being physically. The other sad connotation is the infamous blood libel, the idea that Jews were after Christian blood. That Jews, something that in fact was happening near Venice as well, the black legend that during Pesach, during Passover, Jews would kidnap Christian children and use their blood to bake the matzos. And so this idea of getting and eating Christian flesh may be also related to that myth that originated in England, among other things.
Well, there was a question by Michael Scher saying there actually were Jews in England at the time of Shakespeare, but maybe more hidden, according to, I guess, a Professor Shapiro, maybe. And so he asked whether you think Shakespeare really, did he ever meet a Jew?
Well, I don't know. I know that Shakespeare had this great talent for understanding people, writing about people, even if he had never come across a Danish prince or a Scottish king, or, so I don't think that it really matters. We know that a contemporary of Shakespeare called Thomas Correat, who wrote a few years after The Merchant of Venice, so it could not have been a source for Shakespeare. But this is an Englishman that walked all the way to Venice and made a point of visiting the ghetto, of seeing real Jews, a real Jewish community. There may have been, a few Jewish individuals in England. There were many people who were suspected of being Jewish even after having converted to Judaism. But I don't think that that's, like a crucial point.
There was a question about how the Jews got their money to lend in the first place. So, the Jews, and whether the nature of the lending was a pawn shop or was it a bank? Can you address those questions? So where did Jews get their money to lend? And was it a pawn shop or was it?
In Venice, there are more pawn shops than banks. In other parts of Italy, there were banks, and also depending on different time periods. But in Italy, there was development of real banks because that was almost the necessity. It's so difficult to. This is what I'm telling my students all the time. There were many centuries, before the 11th, 12th century, where Jews were not doing that and they were not associated with money. And it's so difficult to conceptualize it now. But this is a historical thing that at some point Jews were, because of this biblical prohibition to lend money at an interest to your brothers. So that's what Christians didn't want to do. And so said, let's have the Jews do this dirty business.
There's a question of whether you live in the ghetto, these days, and do Jews live in the ghetto? Who lives in the ghetto these days?
Okay, these days, almost no Jews live in the ghetto. I don't live in the ghetto. Actually, I every time I have the few times I have to move house, I made a point to say I don't, because the ghetto means so much to me that I have to keep some sort of safe distance for it. But it's actually a very nice place, and it's. My son goes to play soccer there all the time because it's one of the few places that is not fully, occupied by tourism. And so it's a very sort of lively and vibrant and authentic quarter, but most of the Jews do not live there.
Do the Jews live in another area that's like a Jewish area?
With 400 people, there cannot be a really Jewish area. They're all scattered around.
Mark asked a question about that you made a statement that people misunderstand Shakespeare, Shylock's most famous speech, that you understand it differently. Can you explain, can you share with us how you understand it?
Well, because this is perhaps the one speech by Shakespeare that has been quoted out of context most often than not. And when it is typically quoted, as I did in my slide, it ends when Shylock says, "Oh, we are like you because we're poisoned by the same things. We have the same bodily parts." But the end of the speech is when Shylock says, "If a Jew is wrong a Christian, there's revenge." So which says what makes us humans is not the fact that we have the same blood or we have the same senses, but that we all like and hanker for revenge, which is not a nice concept. It may be actually a very realistic one, but is not as humane as people want it.
Debbie asked, at the height of the ghetto, how many Jews lived there?
Probably 5,000, very crammed. And this is why famously ghetto had the highest buildings in the city, because they had to add, they couldn't expand outwards, so they had to expand upwards and to divide. And one of the reasons, the ironical reasons why the ghetto is not, gentrified is because the apartments are tiny, because all floors were actually divided into two, and so you have to be pretty short to live comfortably in the ghetto.
Jesse asked, do we know how the different, you talked about the different Jewish communities where they came from within the ghetto. I think you mentioned maybe at least 5. Did they get along with each other? Did certain parts of the community succeed more than others? Did they look down upon each other? In America, the Sephardim came first here, and they kind of looked down upon the German Jews who looked down upon the Eastern European Jews. But in this community, it seems like everyone was very tight knit, had to work together. Was there a history of a community being together, or was it very differentiated?
Oh no, it was, it was a typical Jewish story. So initially, they really made a point of being separated. Everyone wanted their community, their synagogue, their ritual, and then over time they merged into one community. They shared their languages. A Judeo-Venetian language developed. So by the time the ghetto was open, those historic differences had been largely forgotten. So the differences survive in the names, in some of the traditions. But other than that, the standard conflict, the synagogue you go to and the one you don't go to.
And Mark Michael Epstein sent me a video. I'm not going to find it from a few years ago when he was there for Purim. So I assume Purim is a great holiday in Venice for the Jewish community.
Oh yeah, I mean, all holidays are special, and especially because now, because of the numbers that I've described, every holiday there is a mixture of locals and visitors.
I don't know whether it's. You still there? Sorry, we had an issue. Okay, just a few last questions, and we'll let you go. I know it's late over there. Okay, let's talk about the this live performance of the Merchant of Venice in Venice in 2016. So I have no idea where did people stand around? Did you sit to watch this thing? Was it recorded? Can we see it? And, how did people react to it, given that everything you've told us about the nature of the character and anti-Semitism?
It's funny, we have hundreds of wonderful professional pictures of the actors, but we failed to capture the magic of the audience. We built risers in the ghetto. So every night there were, I think, 300 people who, sat there and watched I think that, if you Google it, there was a wonderful article in the New York Times, and you could see some of that. Reactions were mostly positive. And I think one crucial element that was appreciated even by people who prefer a more traditional Shakespeare with, let's say, Renaissance costumes with one actor playing one role, was that they understood that it would have been very problematic to make a realistic Shylock in a place where the real Jews had lived. Because the main point was to say Shylock is an incredibly ambivalent character, but he's not a real Jew by any means. Jews were not after pounds of flesh. Jews are not after blood. So this effect of this estranging effect, this defamiliarizing effect, was so important to say, you think of Shylock, but then think of the real Jews of Venice.
Right. We seem to have some issues. If we
by the way, sorry, I forgot to answer the other part of the question, which is, there is a recording of the production, and there is a documentary that is being made by two Chicago filmmakers, and I hope that this documentary will be released very soon, and that will give people a chance to have at least a sense of the beauty of the event.
And when people do come to visit, whether with CSP, where we do a program with you, we'll have Mark Michael as our guide when we finally get to go to, we'll start in Venice, we'll go to Padua, and we'll go to Rome. People have asked, are the synagogues still open and active? Are these old synagogues still open and active? Which I believe they are, but it's when you confirm it to people.
Yeah, they are. The two main ones, the Levantine synagogue and the Spanish synagogue, they alternate between summer and cold season and warm seasons, and you can either visit them through the Jewish Museum that is currently under restoration, or if you want to attend service, you have to get in touch with the community, and everyone is welcome.
Joanne asked a question about the performance. Was it in English? What languages were used for the actual performance in 2016?
Okay, that's a important. We decided to have it in English, but the director made a very important decision to include other languages in the performance, so that all the languages spoken in the ghetto could be heard. So there were some bits in Yiddish, some bits in Venetian, some bits in Spanish. So there was really a way to give a sense of the multilingual ambience of the ghetto, but it was in English.
So you're a professor, you're a teacher, you have students in Italy, and do you teach them the Merchant of Venice? And if so, how do you teach it that you think is different than the way maybe other people would teach it?
Well, I'm teaching the Merchant of Venice right now. And I must say that every time is a challenge. Everything is something which is not like, I'm teaching Hamlet and the Merchant of Venice at the same time. And Hamlet is the most problematic and profound play by Shakespeare. But when I teach Hamlet, I'm not nervous. I'm always a bit nervous when I teach the Merchant of Venice, and because there is so much personal investment, and I no longer know. That's perhaps the most let's say the sort of tricky thing. I never know what a 20-year-old Italian students or European students, because I have a pretty international community of students, knows about the Jews. Jews are not such an important presence in terms of demography, so I don't really know what they know about Jews, but I no longer know what they know about Christianity. The sources, the theological and religious implications of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are no longer so obvious. So their grandparents knew a lot about the Jews, all the wrong things, but they knew what the Jews were, and they knew that Jews had killed Christ in the misguided doctrine of the church. Right now, you don't really know what they know, so it's a bit of a complicated business.
Thank you. Well, thank you for spending time with us, being our first scholar to come to us, Italian scholar, live from Italy, live from Venice. We don't make this. He's not like it's he's not sitting in Orange County at a little cafe. He's in Venice. So I hope that we'll come see you and meet you in person. If you come to California, we hope to host you here as well. Sue Auerbach will make you something nice from her kitchen. Actually, so Shaul Bassi goes to Northern California. He went to Berkeley for a year. He spends way more time in your neck of the woods than he does down here. So that's my friend Sue Auerbach. She will host you. She will feed you. If you find yourself in Berkeley, you call Sue. I will set that up. But you come to Orange County or LA, you come hang out. Louise Sherby is in New York. We got people from all around the country that are watching you right now. They will host you. They will take care of you. But yes, we'll have to go visit you. Those of you who are CSP patrons, remember, we did celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Jewish community in Venice with Professor Bernie Cooperman from University of Maryland. And he talked to us about the ghetto and the origins and how actually it wasn't a bad thing from his perspective, that it actually gave Jews rights that they wouldn't have had to be allowed to be in the city as opposed to be required to be outside. So this fits into many things we've learned over the years. Again, I wanted to thank Shaul Bassi, Mark Michael Epstein, and invite Professor Julia Lupton to do a program for us, which I'll be emailing you about hopefully when Julia sends me some ideas. So with that, I'm going to have lunch with my daughter Claire, who brought me food from LA. And it's nice seeing you all. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Take care. Be safe.
You.
And if you want to move to Venice, I will email you Shaul Bassi's email. He'll set it up for you. Yeah, you can. When you say they have to move permanently, can Sue Auerbach move for a year and just work from there, or do you want permanent residence? That's the question.
No. Temporary residents are also very welcome.
House trade. So Sue Auerbach says house trade. If you're here and you're on from Venice and you would like a beautiful house in Berkeley, California for a year, Sue Auerbach will do the trade right now. You call it. You call me, email me, I'll set it up. Okay. Take care, everybody. Thank you again. That's nice seeing the Wilners. Oh my gosh. And Deb Schubach and the Phillips family and Anita, a lot of regulars. Agota Cooperman, nice to see you. You're new. So welcome Janelle Carino. So I think we have some people with Italian origin as well. Take care, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.